Nightingale Natalie. That's what they called her when they thought she couldn't hear. That, or worse, things whispered in supply closets and laughed about at shift change. They didn't know she'd heard every word. They didn't know the woman restocking trauma shears with military precision had once held a field hospital under siege for 16 hours straight. She wore her invisibility like body armor. But when Captain Owen Reeves rolled through the ER doors on a stretcher, his chest wrapped in field dressings that told a story she recognized in her bones, Natalie Hayes understood that some secrets have an expiration date. What happened next would prove that 3 days, that's all it took to unravel everything she'd built, and to rebuild it all at once. Natalie moved through Oak Creek Memorial in Portland the way a ghost moves through walls, present but unseen, efficient and silent. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like the generators at forward operating base Shank, that sound she'd never quite stopped hearing even after 18 years of civilian life. The antiseptic smell of the hospital masked something underneath, something that only her nervous system recognized, the phantom scent of diesel fuel and blood, of sweat dried into body armor, of dust that clung to everything and refused to wash clean. She restocked the trauma carts in Bay 3 with movements that were economical and precise, each item placed exactly where it needed to be, in the exact order that made sense if you'd ever had to grab something in the dark. Trauma shears, 7.25 inches. Tourniquets from the North African supplier, the kind that didn't slip. 14-gauge angiocath needles in rows. The other nurses found her organization obsessive. They didn't understand that some people arranged things this way because they'd learned that disorganization killed people. Her left hand trembled slightly as she reached for the 4 bags on the top shelf, the tremor that came from shrapnel still embedded near her brachial nerve, fragments the VA had decided weren't worth the surgery to remove. She steadied the tremor by gripping the metal frame of the cart and breathing in counts of 4, the same way she'd breathed through 16 hours of continuous surgery in a bombed-out clinic in Sangin. For counts in. Hold for 4. For counts out. Hold for 4. The rhythm was so ingrained it was automatic now, muscle memory translated into breathing. No one ever noticed. That was the point. Notice meant questions. Questions meant files. Files meant everything. During her break, she sat in the employee lounge with its broken coffee machine and dying succulent, and her hand found the inside of her jacket pocket. The patch was still there, worn soft from years of touching it, a faded Special Forces unit patch, stitched into the lining with thread that matched the original seaming so well you'd have to know it was there to find it. She ran her thumb over the embroidered insignia, the gold outline of the arrowhead dulled to something that looked almost like bronze. The original thread had been replaced twice. She'd done the last replacement herself on a Thursday night at 2 in the morning, sitting at her kitchen table with a needle and the kind of focus that her civilian therapist would probably have called dissociative, but that she understood was simply what it meant to be a person who still lived partially in a different decade. The patch had been made from aircraft wreckage and shrapnel after Sangin, something the team had commissioned from a jeweler in Kandahar. She'd never actually worn it. That would have been too much like admitting it existed. The ER doors hissed open at 14:32. She'd noticed the clock the moment shift change arrived. Her eyes tracked the noise automatically, the way they always did. Reflex. Captain Owen Reeves came through those doors on a stretcher, and the world performed a very specific kind of slow motion that only happens when your body recognizes danger before your mind has finished thinking. He was conscious. That was the first thing she processed. His right leg was wrapped in field dressing, proper field dressing, someone with training had done that, and the left side of his chest had been bandaged with what looked like the contents of a tactical first aid kit. Combat shrapnel wounds. She knew the wound pattern the way she knew the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The paramedic report would say training accident, the way these things always said that. That's what they said when you couldn't tell the truth but couldn't lie directly either. Shrapnel wounds from a training accident meant an IED trainer that had been configured wrong, or explosives that had malfunctioned, or a building collapse during a realistic scenario. It meant someone's mistake and someone's blood. She'd learned to read between those lines long ago. And then recognition hit her like a defibrillator shock. Owen Reeves. Captain Owen Reeves. She'd seen his name on letters her son had mailed from Forward Operating Base Leatherneck in Helmand Province, for years ago, before the tour when her son came back changed and never explained what he wouldn't explain. Captain Reeves is solid, Mom. He's the kind of guy who brings everyone home. That letter, yellowed now, was still in the drawer beside her bed. She'd read it so many times the creases had begun to crack. And now he was bleeding on a stretcher in her emergency room in Portland, Oregon, 1,000 miles from anywhere either of them was supposed to be. The freeze lasted half a heartbeat. Her training kicked in, the civilian overlay that she'd spent 18 years constructing atop the foundation of another life. She stood. She moved toward the beds. She said nothing. Her face arranged itself into the professional blankness she wore like a uniform. But she froze for that half heartbeat, and it was enough. Dr. Marcus Caldwell noticed. He was already there, tablet in hand, his surgical coat still perfectly creased at 14:35 in the afternoon, which meant he'd probably changed it at lunch for appearance's sake. She'd noticed that about him, the kind of obsessive personal presentation that usually indicated a man who believed his appearance was his most important asset. He was scrolling through Reeves' initial intake paperwork, the pre-hospital assessment and vital signs from the paramedic handoff, and his face had gone pale. Not the pale of someone worried about a patient. The pale of someone who'd just noticed something that shouldn't be there. Natalie watched him from across the ER, the way she'd learned to watch things from across compound perimeters. His eyes flickered down the screen. Flickered again. His jaw tightened. She was close enough to see his pupils dilate, stress response, involuntary, and then his hand moved with careful deliberation toward the red X button on the upper right corner of the tablet. Like he was about to close the file. Like he was about to hide what he'd seen. His fingers hovered for exactly 2 seconds before he remembered where he was and that other people could observe this moment. He completed the motion and turned away, but she'd already seen the discrepancies in the pre-hospital documentation. She read upside down as quickly as she read normally, another thing that never came up in civilian conversation. The medication times didn't align. The dosages had been amended, scratched out and rewritten in a different hand. The notation next to pain management administered listed a quantity of morphine that was inconsistent with the other vitals and the narrative timeline. Opioid diversion. The paramedics had been padding the numbers to cover the fact that someone, somewhere in the chain, had been taking medication that wasn't supposed to be available to take. That wasn't her concern. She'd stopped being the person who concerned herself with these things a long time ago. 18 years ago, to be precise. But Captain Reeves was her son's commanding officer, and her son had written a letter saying that this man brought people home. Her hand moved to her jacket pocket, the one she'd checked during break. The patch was still there, stitched into the lining where it had always been, where it would stay forever because she'd never earned the right to wear it on a uniform again. The tremor in her left hand stopped. When she took her hand out of her pocket, it was steady. Her breath had reset itself to that count of 4. Across the emergency room, Dr. Caldwell's eyes met hers for the fraction of a second it took for him to turn from the tablet. Something flickered across his face, recognition of her recognition, the smallest acknowledgement of the moment when she'd seen what he didn't want her to see. His eyes were the kind of cold that came from understanding that she'd observed his moment of near panic. His jaw set in a way that said he'd made a decision. Not a good one. The kind of decision that men like him made when they understood that there was a witness. She looked away first. That was what she was supposed to do. That was how she'd survived 18 years in civilian life, by looking away at exactly the right moments and never, ever making anyone feel threatened by knowing too much. But her hand touched the patch again in her pocket as she walked toward the trauma bay, and her thumb found the fraying thread at the corner of the embroidered arrowhead, and the rhythm of her breathing adjusted itself to match the rhythm of the code cartwheels rolling across the tile floor. 4 counts in. 4 counts out. The same way she'd breathed through Sangin. The same way she'd learned to breathe in places that required breathing patterns instead of breaths. Some secrets, she understood, had an expiration date. And hers had just started its countdown. The overhead page crackled at 1,447 hours, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the afternoon rhythm like a blade through silk. Nightingale Natalie to Station 3. Nightingale Natalie to Station 3. The entire floor went still for half a heartbeat. Then the snickering started. A resident leaned against the med cart, shaking his head with the kind of slow, deliberate mockery that echoed down the corridor. "Guess we know who thinks she's Florence Nightingale reborn." His voice carried just far enough. Always just far enough. The nurses by the supply station exchanged glances, the kind that said they'd heard the page too, that they understood exactly what was happening, that they were choosing which side to stand on. None of them looked at Natalie directly. That was the cruelest part. Not the insult itself, but the choreography of it. The orchestrated humiliation. The way it was timed to maximize witnesses. Natalie's hands didn't shake as she set down the 4 bags she'd been holding. Her jaw didn't clench. Her face remained the neutral mask of someone reading a medication label, utterly absorbed in the mundane task in front of her. She'd learned this composure in a field hospital in Sangin Valley where the walls shook from mortar fire and screaming men needed hands steady enough to hold their lives together. A nickname couldn't touch that. A page couldn't rattle it. She walked to Station 3 without changing pace, without looking left or right, and requested the supplies needed in a voice so level it could have been a metronome. That evening during shift change in the parking lot, Caldwell would escalate. But first came the supply closet. Her break came at 1,623 hours, 20 minutes carved out of the chaos, time enough to step into the dim fluorescent quiet of the storage room and breathe without an audience. She was checking 4 gauges when the door closed behind her with a soft, deliberate click. Dr. Caldwell stood 3 feet away. Then 2 feet. Then close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, the tension radiating from him like heat off asphalt. His face had gone pale when he saw her noticing the medication log. His fingers had tapped that tablet screen the way a predator taps a trap it set. Now he was here, and he was inches from her face, and his voice came low and controlled and laced with something that was supposed to feel like authority but landed like panic. "I saw you looking at files that don't concern you." His words came clipped, precise, rehearsed. "You be wise to request a transfer to county before performance issues start appearing in your record. Nurses who ask questions don't last here." The silence stretched. 3 seconds. 4. The fluorescent tubes hummed their thin, mechanical song. Outside the door, the hospital moved on. Nobody knew he was in here. Nobody would know. Natalie took one measured breath. Let it fill her lungs completely. Exhaled it with the kind of control that came from having done this before, from having stared down fear in places that would have broken him into pieces. One tear escaped, rolling down her cheek with the inevitability of gravity. She didn't trap it. Didn't hide it. She wiped it away with her thumb without looking away from his eyes, and when she spoke, her voice could have cut glass. "I've been threatened by better men than you in places you couldn't survive." The words hung in the air like they had physical weight. Caldwell's jaw went tight. His shoulders stiffened. He stepped back, actually stepped back, his hand reaching for the door handle like it had suddenly become urgent to leave. The moment stretched. He was trying to find something else to say, something that would regain the ground he'd lost, but there was nothing. There was only a woman with one tear on her cheek and a voice that had just told him the absolute truth. He left without another word. Natalie stood alone in the supply closet for another 3 minutes. Her hands were completely steady. Her breathing was completely controlled. She touched the jacket pocket where the faded Special Forces unit patch lay sewn inside the lining, a small square of fabric that had traveled from the chaos of Sangin to this fluorescent quiet, carrying everything she'd been and everything she was trying not to be anymore. The patch was threadbare now, nearly worn through in places. She'd sewn it there the night she'd decided that Natalie Hayes the nurse was easier to survive in than Natalie Hayes the major who'd lost half her team. Some secrets had expiration dates. This one was counting down. The shift change happened in the parking lot at 18:59 hours. The sun was bleeding orange across the concrete, and the evening crew was filtering through in their scrubs and sneakers, ready to take over the night's burden. Caldwell was waiting. He'd positioned himself near the entrance, where the crowd would be thickest, where 20 staff members would hear what he was about to say. "Hayes, you're on permanent night starting tomorrow." His voice carried the easy authority of someone wielding institutional power. "We need someone reliable for the quiet hours." Laughter rippled through the crowd like a wave. Not cruel laughter, exactly, the kind of polite, performative laughter that people offer when a superior says something vaguely dismissive. The kind that lets everyone involved pretend they're not participating in something deliberate. Caldwell smiled. He'd planned this. The timing, the location, the audience. Permanent nights meant isolation. Meant skeleton crews. Meant she'd be working without backup, without senior nurses to ask questions, without the full resources of a busy day shift. It was strategy. It was calculated. It was a man who understood institutional power, using it like a surgeon uses a scalpel, with precision and confidence. Natalie didn't respond. Didn't defend herself. Didn't explain or protest. She simply reached into her jacket pocket, felt the patch there against her fingers, and walked to her car without a word. The gravel crunched under her sneakers. The evening air was cool and carried the smell of diesel exhaust from the ambulance bays. Someone in the crowd called out something else. She didn't catch what, but she didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge it. Didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She sat in her car for 7 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel before she turned the key. The drive home was silent except for the rhythm of the windshield wipers against the Portland drizzle. Rain hammered the glass like applause from an audience that didn't exist yet. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Caldwell had miscalculated. He'd thought he was breaking someone. He didn't understand that she was already broken, already reassembled into something harder than before. He didn't understand what he'd done by isolating her on night shift. He'd just made her completely alone with a dying patient and no witnesses. Natalie's first night shift began at 2,100 hours. She arrived early, 15 minutes before her start time, and the ER was already in that peculiar state of evening quietness, not slow exactly, but different. The afternoon chaos had settled into something more predictable. The fluorescent lights buzzed their thin song. The heart monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Captain Reeves was in room 6, sedated and stable, his chest bandaged, his vital signs monitored by machines that required no compassion, no judgment, no institutional loyalty. Natalie noticed immediately that the staffing was skeletal. 2 experienced nurses who'd been there that morning were gone, reassigned to the 4th floor, the charge nurse said, without meeting her eyes. The on-call thoracic surgeon had been moved to another wing. Transferred out, sudden change, didn't ask questions, just went where he was told. The charge nurse had the look of someone who'd been told not to ask why. It was surgical precision. Caldwell had isolated the right nurses. He'd removed the backup. He'd positioned the pieces on the board like someone playing chess with stakes he understood. What he didn't understand was that Natalie had played in games with much higher stakes. In Sangin, there were no backup surgeons when the mortars came. No experienced nurses standing by. Just the people in the room and the bodies on the tables and the absolute, crystalline knowledge that you either saved them or you didn't. She checked on Captain Reeves at 2,147 hours. His chart showed pain medication dosages that didn't match the vials logged out. The discrepancy was small, professional, deniable, the kind of thing that could be explained as a documentation error. But it was there. She pulled her phone from her pocket with steady hands and photographed the entries, the timestamp, the vials. Evidence. Insurance. She didn't know what she was going to do with it yet, but she knew how to preserve it. The monitor alarm came at 0203 hours. Sharp. Urgent. The kind of sound that cuts through sleep and routine and forces the entire body into crisis mode. Blood pressure dropping. Heart rate climbing. Oxygen saturation beginning its downward slide like a stone sinking in water. Reeves' chest dressing was blooming red. Natalie sprinted to the nursing station and called the code team. No answer. Called again, her voice rising. Again, nothing. The charge nurse was making calls, her face going white. The on-call surgeon was unreachable. The two experienced nurses were 4 floors away. And Captain Owen Reeves, her son's commanding officer, the man who'd saluted her boy when he shipped out, was crashing in room 6 with blood pouring from a chest wound that was reopening like a mouth screaming. She was alone. The realization came without panic, without fear, without any emotion at all. Just a fact. Just the acknowledgement of circumstances. She'd been alone before. She'd held it together before. She knew how. Natalie pulled the faded unit patch from her jacket pocket, the one she'd worn like a talisman for 17 years, and set it on the supply tray beside the crash cart, a small square of worn fabric that carried the weight of every surgery she'd ever performed in places where failure meant bodies in body bags. Then she moved to the equipment, her hands already knowing where to go, already remembering what came next. The voice she used on the intercom was calm and absolute. I need a thoracic tray to room 6 and someone find me any surgeon in this building. Now. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial began with a skeleton crew, and Natalie recognized the deliberate architecture of it immediately. 2 experienced nurses, Chen and Morales, who knew how to move through a crisis without needing instructions, had been reassigned to pediatrics and the orthopedic floor. The charge nurse, a woman named Halstead who'd been avoiding eye contact with Natalie all week, handed her a tablet with 6 patients already assigned. 6. On a normal night shift, 6 meant manageable. On a night when Caldwell had systematically stripped away backup, 6 meant drowning in slow motion. The on-call surgeon, Dr. Patel, had been moved to the North Tower for emergency appendectomies. Not a mistake. Natalie had overheard Caldwell on the phone that afternoon. Patel needs to handle the surgical queue. Hayes' floor can manage with a resident on call. The resident was fresh out of his 2nd year, brilliant with textbooks, inexperienced with the kind of bleeding that didn't wait for protocols. Captain Reeves was in Trauma Bay 3, stable on paper. Vitals holding. The shrapnel wounds had been cleaned and bandaged. His blood pressure was 118/72. His oxygen saturation was 97%. But Natalie had spent 16 hours in Sangin watching men who looked stable right up until they weren't, watching the moment when a reopened wound became a waterfall and protocols became suggestions and training became everything. She checked his dressings every 30 minutes instead of the standard hourly rotation. The senior nurse in her, the one who'd held a field hospital together while mortars walked across the roof, knew something was coming. By 2:16 a.m., Captain Reeves' heart rate had crept to 104. By 3:15, it was 118. His blood pressure had started its descent, 116/70. The numbers were heading in the wrong direction like a countdown clock that nobody else could hear. Natalie was in the equipment room on the 3rd floor retrieving sterile dressing supplies when the cardiac monitor in Trauma Bay 3 began its escalation, a steady beat that quickened into a trot, then a gallop. She froze for exactly 1 second. The sound of a monitor accelerating was the same in Portland as it had been in Sangin, a language spoken by the body when it was beginning to fail. She dropped the supplies and moved. The monitor's pace increased. 130 beats per minute. 140. The alarm tone rose in pitch, becoming insistent, then urgent. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent. The hallway was empty. It was 3:22 a.m. on a Tuesday in Portland, and the night shift had contracted to its narrowest point, skeleton crews running on momentum and muscle memory. When Natalie reached Trauma Bay 3, Captain Reeves was conscious but pale, his jaw clenched against pain that had suddenly become catastrophic. His chest wound, the one the surgeons had closed, the one that was supposed to hold, had reopened. Not slowly. Violently. Blood was soaking through the fresh bandages at a rate that meant the internal bleeding had resumed with lethal intent, and the blood loss was accelerating faster than any foot could replace it. "Call the surgeon," Natalie said, her voice level as she was already moving to grab a crash cart. "Call radiology." Get Patel from North Tower. He's in an active appendectomy, Halstead said, her voice small, uncertain. Caldwell said, call him. Now. Natalie didn't wait for confirmation. She was already draping Reeves with sterile sheets, already assessing the damage with hands that had done this before on cots and blankets and ground that smelled like diesel and copper. The wound had dehisced along the surgical closure. The internal bleeding was catastrophic. His blood pressure was dropping like a stone in dark water, 96/58. Then 88/52. His heart was compensating by beating harder, faster, a desperate rhythm of a body in shock. I need a scalpel, she said. Not a question. Not a request. From the crash cart, Halstead said, moving without understanding why. The scalpel was in her hand. The blade was cold steel. Her fingers found the landmarks on his chest the way they always did, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, muscle memory made flesh. The training in her hands was older than her current job, older than her current name, carved into muscle fibers by 16 hours in a field hospital in Sangin where you learn to make impossible decisions in darkness and blood. The incision was perfect. Clean. Precise. The kind of cut that came from having done it before when the alternative was watching someone die. Blood emerged. Dark venous blood, the color of catastrophe. She extended the incision with the aggressive competence of someone who'd run out of time for hesitation. The ribs lay beneath like white architecture. She found the spreader in her peripheral vision. Halstead had it ready, moving on instinct now, understanding without being told that they'd crossed into territory where standard protocols were luxuries they couldn't afford. The chest opened. Her hands moved with the precision of machinery, all tremor burned away by necessity. She found the bleeder, a small vessel that had been controlled in surgery but had let go under the stress of blood loss and cardiac demands. A satin sky clamp came from somewhere. Her left hand clamped the vessel while her right hand found his heart. It was smaller than she expected it to be. They always were, when you held them. His heart was in fibrillation. The rhythm was chaos, the electrical system fractured, the muscle quivering instead of contracting. She began manual compression with the steady rhythm of someone who'd kept worse hearts beating in worse places. Her hand moved in the chambers of his chest, pumping blood that his own heart could no longer manage. 1 compression. 2. 3. The mechanical continuation of a failing system. Blood soaked through her scrubs. It ran down her forearms. It smelled like iron and urgency and the specific silence that comes when the room understands it's watching someone choose between death and all the protocols that had ever mattered less than this single moment. "O2," she said. Running at 15, Halstead's voice was steady now, caught in the certainty of someone watching competence in motion. Sats climbing. 84. 87. 90. 92. 3 minutes. That's how long she'd been inside his chest. The monitor still showed fibrillation, but the O2 numbers were climbing because she was doing the work his body couldn't. 60 seconds more. His heart was still in her hand. The rhythm was beginning to organize, the chaos settling into something that resembled a pattern. 94. 96. 1 more compression. And then a voice from the doorway. Jesus Christ. Dr. Patel stood in the threshold, still in surgical scrubs from the appendectomy, his face the particular shade of white that comes from walking into a scene that violates every rule he'd been taught. His eyes locked on her hand inside Reeves' chest. On the perfect thoracotomy. On the surgical precision of a field procedure that shouldn't exist in the middle of a Portland hospital at 3:25 in the morning. "Step aside," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The kind that comes when a surgeon watches another surgeon work. Natalie withdrew her hand and stepped back without a word. Patel moved into her space with the fluid certainty of expertise. His hands were steady as they took over the compression, as he assessed the clamped vessel, as he guided the mechanical continuation of Reeves' life with the authority of someone who'd trained for exactly this moment. "Get me 2 units of O negative," Patel said to Halstead. Suction. I'm going to need to explore this more thoroughly, but the hemorrhage is controlled. His rhythm. Sinus, Natalie said quietly. Started organizing about 90 seconds ago. Patel's hands moved through the opening she'd created, and Natalie watched him work with the peculiar calm that comes when you've just stepped out of an impossible moment. He was good. Efficient. His hands knew exactly where the bleeder was because she'd already found it, had already stopped it, had already kept Reeves alive long enough for surgery to mean something. 20 minutes later, the wound was closed. Reeves' heart was doing its own work again, steady and willing. His blood pressure was stabilizing. The crisis had passed in the way crises did, from impossible to merely critical to potentially survivable in the space of 30 minutes, and one pair of hands that had been trained by necessity in a place most people would never see. Patel turned to her as he was stripping off his gloves. Where did you learn that? Natalie was already washing blood from her arms under the sink. The water ran pink, then lighter pink, then clear. Field training, she said without turning around. Not a lie. The most precise truth she could offer. Patel didn't pursue it. He was looking at the thoracotomy closure the way someone looks at a signature, the way he was beginning to understand that this nurse wasn't a nurse in the way he'd thought, wasn't a floor staff member who'd overstepped her scope. She was something else entirely, something that had moved through his hospital in scrubs and silence and had just saved a man's life with a combat blade from a crash cart because nobody had stopped her. He left without speaking again. The moment he was gone, Natalie heard boots on tile in the corridor. Not a patient. Not the measured pace of the night shift. The solid, purposeful approach of someone with authority and anger. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway with 2 security guards and the hospital administrator, Susan Voss, whose face had the pale, shocked expression of someone who'd just watched the security footage. Caldwell's face was controlled fury, the particular mask of someone who'd just watched his careful sabotage implode into something he couldn't spin. He opened his tablet without speaking. His fingers moved across the screen with the precision of someone documenting a crime. Unauthorized surgical procedure, he said, his voice level as water. Scope of practice violation. Patient endangered through reckless protocol deviation. He looked up from the tablet to meet her eyes. Nurse Hayes, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Your access to patient records is revoked as of now. Natalie didn't respond. She was still washing blood from under her fingernails. The water was cold. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. In the distance, a monitor beeped with the steady rhythm of a patient whose heart was working on its own again. Do you understand? Caldwell said, his voice taking on an edge because she hadn't flinched, hadn't trembled, hadn't given him any reaction at all beyond the simple continuation of washing her hands. I understand, she said, finally. Her voice was the same as it had always been, steady, measured, the voice of someone who'd absorbed worse threats in worse places and had simply continued living. The administrator was already making calls. Hospital legal. Risk management. The documentation trail was being sealed the way these things were sealed, with lawyers and liability assessments and the careful architecture of institutional protection. By dawn, it was over. Her badge had been collected. Her access codes had been deactivated. A cardboard box had been produced, and she'd placed inside it the things that had accumulated in her locker over 11 years at Oak Creek Memorial, a cracked coffee mug from a hospital fundraiser, a dying succulent that someone had given her 3 years ago, a photograph of her team from Sangin, 14 men in digital camouflage, half of them gone now, their faces frozen in time. Her son's last letter from deployment was tucked beneath that photograph, the envelope worn soft from reading. It had arrived 3 weeks before the IED that had killed him. She sat at a rain-soaked bus stop on Southeast Morrison Street with the cardboard box on her lap. The rain fell with the steady percussion of routine, indifferent to the woman holding a box of remnants, indifferent to the fact that she'd just saved a life and lost everything in the process. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining, where it had been for 16 years, a talisman from a life she'd tried to leave behind, invisible to everyone, including the man who'd just destroyed her career without understanding what he'd actually threatened. She sat in the rain without moving, watching the cardboard absorb water, watching the photograph of Sangin begin to blur as moisture seeped through the box's bottom. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub, saving lives in the dark. She'd learned that lesson a long time ago, in a place most people would never see, doing work that the world had moved on from and expected her to have moved on from too. The rain continued. The bus didn't come. And somewhere in Oak Creek Memorial, Captain Reeves was breathing on his own, alive because a nurse had chosen the patient over protocol, had chosen the impossible over the safe, had chosen what was right when everything else was taken away. That mattered. It had to matter. The monitors screamed. 3 days had passed since the supply closet threat, 3 days of night shift isolation, and now Captain Reeves lay on the gurney with his chest wound, hemorrhaging like a severed mane. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading, soaking through the trauma dressing in seconds. Natalie's eyes registered the numbers first, BP 68/40 and dropping, oxygen saturation cratering toward 62, heart rate climbing toward 160 as his body fought a losing battle against exsanguination. Caldwell had reassigned every experienced nurse. The on-call surgeon was somehow unreachable. The floor was deliberately empty at 2:02 a.m. It wasn't an accident. It was architecture. She moved. Not quickly. Quickly was panic. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had held bleeding soldiers in her hands across 16 hours in Sangin while mortars shook the walls and the smell of copper and dust became the smell of survival. The crash cart was already rolling. A 14-gauge angiocath needle slid into Reeves' groin with the ease of muscle memory. Fluid pouring in. 1 liter. 2 liters. The numbers climbing but his pressure still falling, because the bleeding wasn't from a vessel she could reach from outside. The scalpel came from the emergency thoracotomy tray. Cold steel. She didn't hesitate. Didn't check a protocol or call for permission. Major Natalie Hayes had cracked 100 chests in forward surgical teams where the only protocol was keeping people alive. The blade cut through skin and intercostal muscle with the same smooth motion it had learned in a tent outside Kandahar. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. The incision was perfect, textbook surgical precision that no nurse in Portland should possess. Blood spilled. She clamped the right mainstem bronchus first, her gloved fingers moving inside a man's open chest cavity like she was reading a map written in tissue and arterial spray. There. The bleeder. Pulmonary artery laceration from the original shrapnel wound, bleeding internally with every heartbeat. She applied a vascular clamp with the same steady hands that had once held a 20-year-old Marine's intestines while waiting for the surgeon. Manually compressing his heart now, each compression forcing oxygen into his brain, each squeeze buying seconds that surgeons needed to arrive. The chest wall was warm and wet. Her fingers knew this intimately, this specific temperature of human survival. The room around her had gone completely quiet. The monitors still beeped but she wasn't hearing them anymore. She was in Sangin. She was in a surgical tent lit by Coleman lanterns. She was saving her own men because there was no one else left to do it. Where's the surgeon? Her voice. Flat. Controlled. The voice of someone who had given orders while receiving incoming fire. Nobody answered. Everyone was staring at the hand of a hospital nurse performing open cardiac massage inside a combat casualty. The OR surgeon arrived at 2:54 a.m., Dr. Patricia Chen, the one surgeon Caldwell couldn't convince to leave the hospital that night because she lived in the basement apartment and had simply ignored the administrator's call. She stopped in the doorway and her face went white. Not because of the blood. Not because of the open chest. She went white because she was staring at a perfect combat thoracotomy performed with the precision of someone who had saved dozens of lives exactly like this. How long? Chen's voice was steady. She'd served herself, Army Medical Corps, 7 years. 2 minutes. Natalie didn't look up. Pulmonary artery. Clamps holding but he needs a proper repair. Chen moved like she'd been waiting for this. They wheeled Reeves toward the OR, Natalie's hand still inside his chest, still compressing, still keeping the blood flowing to a brain that was minutes away from permanent damage. The stretcher wheels squeaked against tile that had never heard this story before. By 3:06 a.m., Captain Owen Reeves was under Chen's hands in the OR with his chest properly opened and his wound fully exposed to a surgeon who could see exactly what Natalie had done and recognized it as legitimate trauma medicine. He lived. His pressure stabilized. His oxygen saturation climbed back to normal. By dawn, Captain Reeves was in the ICU with a closed chest, a working heart, and a debt to a nurse who had operated on him. By dawn, Natalie was fired. Dr. Marcus Caldwell had spent the night destroying evidence. He'd called the hospital board at 4:22 a.m. with a voice shaking with rage and rehearsed urgency. Serious protocol violation. A nurse, Hayes, performed an invasive surgical procedure on a patient without physician authorization. She cracked his chest open. She could have killed him. This is a liability nightmare. We need her terminated before the board finds out. The falsified incident report was already drafted. He'd been working on it for hours, reframing her emergency intervention as reckless overreach, her medical knowledge as insubordination, her decision to save a life as practicing medicine without a license. By 6:15 a.m., he'd systematically removed her access to the patient record system. Her badge still worked for the staff entrance, but when she tried to check Reeves' post-operative status, the system locked her out. Access denied. A message appeared, contact human resources. She didn't need to know what came next. She already knew. The termination meeting happened in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and old air conditioning. Garrett from HR was a thin man whose eyes couldn't find her face. He read from a document in the flat voice of someone who'd been told exactly what to say. Practicing outside the scope of nursing practice. Performing invasive surgical procedures without physician authorization. Patient safety concern. Effective immediately. Please surrender your hospital badge and access credentials. His hands trembled as he slid the termination letter across the desk. Not anger trembled. Fear. He knew what she'd done. He knew she'd saved a life. He was firing her anyway. Is he stable? Natalie's voice was quiet. The quiet of someone with nothing left to lose. Captain Reeves. Is he stable? Garrett's eyes finally met hers for 1 second. He's stable. Asking for you, actually, but you're not authorized for patient contact anymore. She nodded once. That was enough. The rest was administration. She handed her badge across the desk and walked out through the staff entrance where she'd once entered with purpose, where she'd been invisible, where she'd been safe in her silence. The rain started as she reached the bus stop. Not a gentle rain, aggressive rain that soaked through the cardboard box containing her life before she even sat down on the bench. A cracked mug from her apartment. A dying succulent she'd tried to keep alive for 3 years, now tipping sideways, spilling soil onto yellowed paper. Her son's last letter from deployment, the one he'd mailed 18 days before his Humvee hit an IED outside Marja. She read it again in the grey dawn light, the words already memorized but needed anyway. Mom, Captain Reeves is the best CO I've ever had. He takes care of us. I'm glad you're somewhere safe now. Safe. She'd thought that's what this was, this hospital job, this invisibility, this carefully constructed ordinary life where no one asked questions about her hands or her scars or the way she moved like someone trained to survive things that would break most people. Safe meant anonymous. Safe meant nobody looking too close. Safe meant Captain Reeves would live his life and never know why, would move forward without understanding that the woman he asked for from his hospital bed had held his heart in her hands at 2:54 a.m. and refused to let it stop. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it back beneath the photograph. That photograph. 8 people in desert camouflage standing in front of a HESCO barrier with Sangin Valley stretching behind them. 16 hours under siege. 43 surgeries. She could name every face. She could name the four who didn't come home. She could name the one that had become someone else's face on a letter mailed to a woman who'd learned to be invisible. Half of them dead now. A nurse she recognized from Oak Creek walked past the bus stop, saw her, and crossed the street without making eye contact. The calculus had already begun. Association with a terminated employee was dangerous. Natalie touched the patch in her pocket, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the talisman from a life she'd left behind, and let her hand fall. The patch had been with her since the medical discharge 6 years ago. It had survived her reinvention as a nurse, her silence, her careful navigation through a hospital where she'd learned to be invisible. The bus arrived at 7:12 a.m. She boarded and found a seat in the back, staring at her reflection in the rain-streaked window. Behind her eyes was the face of a woman who'd just lost everything again, not to combat, not to enemy fire, but to institutional machinery, and a man who understood that the fastest way to destroy someone was to punish them for saving a life. Behind the scenes, in his office on the 4th floor, Dr. Marcus Caldwell was deleting security footage. His hands weren't steady anymore. The hospital's security system recorded everything, and everything included the night he'd reassigned staff, the moment he'd rerouted the surgeon's emergency call, the hour he'd deliberately cleared the floor around Captain Reeves' room. All of it was on video. All of it was evidence. He selected the files with shaking fingers, watching the timestamps disappear: 2:15 a.m., 2:22 a.m., 2:53 a.m. Delete. 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 He didn't notice the server room door cracked open. He didn't notice Torres watching from the darkness. Torres, the IT administrator, the Marine veteran with 8 years of service before his bad knee ended his contract, the one who'd served in Helmand Province and recognized the sound of a trauma code that was something beyond a trauma code. The one who'd watched a nurse walk up to a man who looked dead and perform something that looked exactly like field medicine. Every deleted file was automatically backing up. Every frame that Caldwell thought he was erasing was being preserved on an external drive that Torres would personally deliver to his contact at the FBI field office by noon. The Bureau had been investigating opioid diversion at Oak Creek Memorial for 6 months. They had patterns. They had witness statements. They had nothing until now. Now they had video evidence of a physician systematically clearing obstacles to let a patient die, and instead a nurse had shown up like a ghost and performed an emergency surgical procedure that saved a life and destroyed a career. Caldwell didn't know any of this. He was just deleting, just trying to remove the evidence of his deliberate negligence, thinking he was destroying the narrative before anyone could connect the dots. Thinking he was winning. The bus carrying Major Natalie Hayes pulled away from the stop at 7:13 a.m., heading west, away from Portland, away from Oak Creek Memorial, away from the only identity she'd allowed herself since the medical discharge 6 years ago. She was staring at her reflection in the rain-streaked window when her phone buzzed once. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "Captain Reeves is asking for you. He's stable. Someone needs to know." She looked at the message for a long time, then put the phone away. Someone already knew. Somewhere in the machinery of the federal government, someone was looking at video files and building a case. Someone was connecting dots. Someone was coming. She just didn't know it yet. Captain Reeves regained consciousness on the 3rd day with his eyes searching the ceiling tiles like he was reading coordinates, and the first coherent word out of his mouth was her name. Natalie Hayes. Not a question. A statement. A summons. The night nurse paged her immediately, and Natalie stood at the foot of his bed watching color return to his face, watching the oxygen saturation climb from 91 to 94 to 96, watching a man who should have been dead do the impossible thing, breathe. He didn't ask how he survived. He didn't ask about the surgery or the bleeding or the midnight miracle. He just stared at her and said, "You." One word that carried the weight of 16 hours in a field hospital under fire, 43 surgeries performed with mortar rounds shaking the walls, hand steady as surgical lasers while shells exploded outside. She nodded once. That was enough. An hour later, HR called her at home. A woman's voice, apologetic, asking if she could come in to provide a witness statement for the captain's incident report, nothing unusual, just standard protocol. She was tired. She was grieving the job she'd lost, the coffee still cold on her kitchen table from that morning. She said yes. The moment she walked into the administration office, the air pressure changed. Someone had made a call. Someone important had pulled a thread that unraveled everything. The HR coordinator's face was pale as she ran the background check, her hands trembling as the classified file loaded on the secure terminal. The IT administrator, the Marine veteran who'd preserved Caldwell's deleted footage, stood in the corner watching, arms crossed, knowing what was coming. The door opened and a man in civilian clothes entered, chest barrel wide, shoulders like a defensive lineman, with the kind of presence that made fluorescent lights seem dimmer by comparison. Commander Price, SEAL Team Operations, Natalie's former commanding officer. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain hammering the Portland parking lot outside. Captain Reeves lay in his hospital bed 3 floors above them, and when the cardiologist came in to check his post-operative vitals, Reeves asked for Major Hayes. Not Natalie. Not the nurse. Major. The word traveled down through the intercom, down through the medical records department, down into the administrative office where 4 people were standing over a classified file, and the nurse coordinator whispered it like a prayer. He called her Major. The cardiologist stopped writing. The administrator's pen went down. Commander Price's jaw clenched, and he picked up the secure phone and made one call. 1. By the time that call connected, the file was already open. Bronze Star. Bronze Star. Silver Star. The medals listed like evidence of a life nobody knew she'd lived. The nurse coordinator's hand shook as she read them aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Silver Star. 2 Bronze Stars. Anna, she looked up at Commander Price, and he nodded once. She finished the sentence. Navy Cross nomination. Major Hayes held a field hospital under siege for 16 hours in Sangin. Commander Price's voice filled the small office like a diesel engine idling in a garage, steady and powerful. Performed 43 surgeries under mortar fire with a team of 4 medics and a pharmacist who was 22 years old. When the insurgents breached the outer perimeter, she moved casualties from the main operating tent to the underground bunker with RPG shrapnel falling like rain. Saved my entire unit. Saved 214 Marines that afternoon alone. He paused. Let that number settle. That's who you fired. The administrator looked like he'd been slapped. The nurse coordinator was crying without making a sound. The IT administrator nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd suspected all along. An FBI agent entered the room like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. He was older, gray at the temples, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing too much about how people hurt each other. We've been investigating opioid diversion at Oak Creek Memorial for 7 months, he said, pulling out a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. 17 patients. $42,000 in diverted oxycodone hitting the street. We had the pattern. We had the timeline. What we didn't have was proof until yesterday. He placed a stack of photographs on the table, security footage still showing Caldwell's hands, Caldwell's distinctive watch, Caldwell's signature on controlled substance logs. Dr. Marcus Caldwell attempted to delete the security footage at 4:06 a.m. 3 days ago. Unfortunately for him, the hospital IT administrator, he nodded at the Marine in the corner, preserved every frame and delivered it directly to our federal investigators at 6:15 a.m. the same morning. The rain outside intensified, hammering the windows like applause for something nobody could quite celebrate yet. 6 months passed in the kind of slow, grinding justice that never makes headlines but changes everything. Dr. Caldwell's medical license was revoked by the state board after a hearing where victim after victim testified about medication irregularities, about suspicions they'd had, about times when their pain management hadn't made sense. His wife filed for divorce. His legal team negotiated a plea deal to avoid federal prison, 5 years probation, $100,000 in restitution, lifetime ban from medical practice. The final image of that phase was Caldwell sitting in his lawyer's office, signing the agreement with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, as if his body knew what his mind was refusing to admit. he'd picked a fight with someone who had nothing left to lose, and he'd lost everything instead. Natalie returned to Oak Creek Memorial, but not as a floor nurse. The hospital offered her the head of trauma training position, with a salary 30% higher than what she'd been earning and an apology written on hospital letterhead that she never read all the way through. Captain Reeves completed his recovery with her guidance, his chest scar healing clean and pink, and when he was cleared for duty, he saluted her in the discharge hallway. Her son Jeremy had been granted emergency leave from his unit, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, to attend a ceremony. She didn't know about it yet. 6 months after her termination, Natalie was walking past a strip mall in northeast Portland on her lunch break, passing storefront windows and coffee shops, when she glimpsed Dr. Caldwell through the glass of Liberty Insurance. He was sitting at a folding table beneath a banner that read "A New Agent's Welcome," explaining policy details to an elderly couple who looked skeptical. His suit was cheaper than it used to be. His watch was gone. When he saw her through the window, she held his gaze for 3 seconds, and the look on his face was the kind of realization that comes too late, that he'd never understood who he was standing next to. She kept walking. That afternoon, she stood in the White House Rose Garden in her dress uniform, the same one she hadn't worn since Sangin, and the president pinned another commendation on her chest. Her son Jeremy stood in his combat fatigues beside Captain Reeves, both of them saluting as cameras flashed and rain began to fall on the roses. The unit patch was now sewn visibly onto her dress uniform, no longer hidden in the jacket lining where she'd carried it for 7 years like a talisman from a life she thought she'd left behind. Commander Price stood in the front row with the rest of her old unit, the ones who'd survived the siege, the ones who'd waited a decade to see her name in the light instead of in the shadows. After the ceremony, Jeremy hugged his mother and whispered, "You never told me." She touched the unit patch on her chest and replied, "I didn't think I had the right anymore." Captain Reeves approached and shook her hand with a grip that said everything words couldn't. "Major, your son is the finest soldier I've served with. Now I know why." The three of them walked out of the Rose Garden together, laughing about something as the late sun caught her medals and turned them gold. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your strength, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's hear your story. And share this video with someone who needs to remember that true power isn't a title. True power is what you do when the world stops watching.